We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Well, it's left to me to wrap up before, but we're not really wrapping up. We're wrapping up before a question and answer session that Isabel will start to lead in a second, but I do get to wrap up. It's kind of, I'm thinking and saying, what can I do to wrap up after some of these talks, which are extraordinary, right? And, I just was thinking of a few things. One of them is, we talk about genetic variation and how it contributes, and we see that there's this notion of a normal distribution and this idea that you can have very, very rare extreme abilities due to kind of common genetic variation. At the same time, we have very rare syndromes in which, like Williams syndrome and some of the other things that we heard about, like KE family, very rare genetic mutations that instead of being an additive of thousands of variation that's coming through the population, that kind of lightning hits and and that gives us insight. And so kind of as physicians, scientists, and as, who are curious about these, when we see this, both of those kind of provide us with extraordinary ability or, potential to get insight. So, I thought that's an important kind of point to bring out, that, the study of rare may be a rare genetic mutation, but it may be rare because of common variation as well, and both are, kind of provide us with exceptional insights, as I hope you heard from the many talks today. Really a lot of food for thought, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. But first I wanted to thank all the speakers, number one, for sticking to time, which is very, very hard when you want to talk about your work and stuff, your baby. Really, everybody stuck to time and gave an incredibly cogent, beautiful, beautiful talk. So I want to thank everybody for their talks. And now I'm looking forward to a good bit of beautiful and very tough questions, I'm sure. Yeah.
So I have a lot of questions for Margot on the memory effect, and maybe I'll ask Jamie Ward to come and discuss with him answers to those questions. But I'll start first I have two questions for Karen Berman. Well, I have two questions. Maybe it's better that you read them. Oh, okay, I'll do it. Were Williams' patients recognized before genetics started?
So that's a very good question. Indeed, they were recognized, but not as such. I forget the year, but decades ago, Williams and Baran, whose name I always mispronounce, characterized a syndrome that was typified by infantile hypercalcemia, failure to thrive, and elfin faces. And in fact, when I was in medical school, I won't tell you how long ago that was, but a long time ago, that's what we had called it, was elfin syndrome. The genetic cause of this disorder was discovered in the 90s by my colleague Colleen Morris. So it's been a very interesting evolution. Since that time, physicians sort of index of suspicion, their ability to pick up if there was a failure to thrive or a particular facial construct in babies and small children has increased, and there's a much greater recognition now, and of course a great interest in neurobiology and behavior.
Related questions, very related, is can you encounter cases where you cannot check that it is a genetic defect, but it is idiopathic kind of form of Williams syndrome, like you can find in autism, for example? That's not my question. Huh?
I'm gonna try to address that. So Williams syndrome is pretty specific and does depend, at least these days, on the genetic underpinnings. I will mention, this is a little bit of a tangent, but in my slide I didn't emphasize this, but more than 96% of people with autism have almost the exact same deletion on chromosome 7, and this is highly unusual that it's so stereotyped, and this is because of what I explained, the flanking regions having very similar sequences of DNA and sort of getting mixed up. However, there are very rare people who have smaller deletions in that same portion of chromosome 7, and they have only pieces of the Williams syndrome clinical phenotype. For example, people who just have a couple of genes deleted called elastin and LIMK1 have the spatial problems, but not the personality problems. So these very rare folks, and we've now brought to the NIH for study 5 families, 5 kindreds, and 7 singleton children who have these small deletions, and we hope that that will enable us to sort of dissect the genes that are involved in a more specific way. My point in bringing this up is that the people who have these just several genes deleted are not picked up because they have the behavioral phenotype at all. They're actually picked up because they have a cardiac problem, because one of the genes that's hemideleted is elastin, which forms the walls of our arteries. So they have a cardiovascular problem, and they're picked up. And it's only apparent that they have the visuospatial construct problem when they're tested, but they'll tell you if you talk to them, gee, I had problems in this area in school, I wasn't very good in geometry, and other things like that. So the short answer is no, I don't think that we pick up people who have idiopathic Williams syndrome, because it is by definition a genetic disorder now that we know about it, and it is related to the first question.
So thank you, Karen. And now Simon Fisher, I have an interesting question for you, an easy one, I think.
You can answer it easy.
No, I would leave it to you. What does a FOXP2 mutation do to a songbird?
Oh, okay. That's good. That's great, because there's a whole talk on that, which I didn't do. We don't know, we can't actually knock out FOXP2 in songbirds because we don't yet have the technology to knock it out completely from embryos of songbirds, although that's coming. But people have been able to use viruses to manipulate the levels of FOXP2 protein that the gene makes in certain parts of the brain. And people have studied one particular songbird, which is the zebrafinch. So young male zebrafinches, they hear a song sung by an adult male tutor, and they learn to make a pretty accurate copy of that. And they're not the prettiest songs in the world, zebrafinch songs, but they have a certain level of complexity and different syllable types and different structures. And the males sing to the females, and it's a learned thing. They have to be exposed to a template when they're young. And lots is known about the neurobiology of how these zebrafinch males are able to learn these songs. And they have particular parts of the brain, particular kind of nuclei in the brain, including one in the striatum called area X, that are important for this learning process. And so some researchers in Berlin, led by Constance Scharf, noticed that the levels of FOXP2 protein that were being made in area X were going up around the developmental time when the birds are learning their songs. So they interfered with, using these viruses, they injected viruses into area X of young birds learning these songs, and they knocked down the amount of FOXP2 that was being made, and they found that the songs were then not copied as accurately as the control birds who had the gene knocked down in a different place, or ones that had a kind of dummy knockdown. And there's lots more work that's been done on that, but it's interesting to see that this is something that this kind of auditory guided vocal learning, the need to listen to something and then and reproduce a copy of it, can be interfered with in a songbird with FOXP2 knockdown.
Several questions for James Mago, and I think it would be more fun to ask also Jamie Ward to come up soon. Soon. Let's first ask. I mean, there are so many questions. I don't know where to start. Okay. Okay, maybe the first one. What are the downsides of being, such a HSAM? In short, what, did evolution ensure we all have that opportunity?
What's the downside?
Yeah,
well,
first.
The one first obvious downside is illustrated by the very poor subject who came to me. She contacted me because she is plagued by her strong, bad memories. She has awful memories. As a matter of fact, I doubt that her experiences in life are much worse than those that most of us have. But she remembers every one of them, and so she dwells on them. I think that she contacted me initially because she had some kind of an idea that if she could contact me, that they would go away or that I would do something. She kept diaries. She didn't keep diaries for the reason that most people do. They keep diaries because they want to cherish the wonderful things in their lives. Her idea was that if she wrote it down in her diary, that it would go away. That was the plan on her part. So that's the downside. For other people who have this ability, I don't see a downside. Louise Owen, the professional violinist, has a wonderful life, and she's not plagued. She's rather pleased that she can call up these experiences of the past. Is this being filmed? Do you know? Yeah. It is? Oh. Let me simply say that it can sometimes make for difficult personal relationships if you remember and the spouse or the other does not. Maybe you've had that happen.
All right. And okay, I can see it has an impact on the audience. No. Okay, the next question is really related to something you have in common. Because, there are many questions, but the fact is it only for calendar or for dates that they have this kind of memory? Or do they learn better, at school? Or?
No. First of all, they don't learn better at school for the most part. They're quite average, and they don't learn better in the laboratory. They're quite average in learning in the laboratory. But there are disadvantages, as I said. In the laboratory, we've tried to teach them all kinds of things, and they really don't do any better at it than you and I do on the average.
So it's a special form of memory.
It's a special form of memory, but there's a caveat in all of the work that we have done, and it's a very serious caveat. and that is we identify these people on the basis of us telling us days and dates. That's how we get them. And we have about 100 people who can do that out of a U.S. population of 330 million. We have had, as you probably saw in one of the slides, a large number of people who claim that they have this ability, but they don't. Now they don't, maybe they don't, because they don't tag their memories with dates. And in order to be in our studies, they have to be able to tag their memories with dates. Now we're caught in a trap. If they can't if we can't assess their memories with dates, how on earth are we going to validate them? You see, that's the problem. And so there may be a lot of those people who failed our test may have an ability like this, but they don't tag it with dates. And so that's a very big caveat, and we have tried to figure out how to deal with that. I get, even today, about 2 people a week. When this first opened up, on one day, I got 600 people who claimed that they had this ability. But most of them do not live in Irvine. If they all lived in Irvine, we could solve a lot of problems, but they live all over the world, and we only bring the superstars to Irvine because it costs a lot of money to bring them up and put them up for a week while we're studying them. If we could figure out a way of assessing people who claim they have this ability but don't do dates, we could learn more.
Okay. So, thank you. All right. So I see that Jamie doesn't want to comment on this. Do you have your own perspective on the same kind of phenomenon, or?
Not so much. I mean, I think I would agree with you that it strikes me that it's the date stamping thing that's interesting about them, and that's what made me wonder whether some of them have synesthesia. I think Jill Price does, but whether it's a common trait. I guess, you can't, if I asked you a question, do you think that they could tell you what date it's going to be, say, on the 3rd of June 2020? Could they do that? Because that's not a memory test, that's something about the calendar. Yes. You think they could do that? Yeah, that was kind of my hunch. So I think a lot of the ability is around having the calendar as a kind of a tool.
Just to mix it up a little bit, we do have a couple questions for Isabel, and she didn't want to ask herself the questions. And actually, a few of them actually appeared here, so there's a very common question, which is Chinese is a tonal language, and I guess the question is a general question. That is, do tonal languages, there's this idea that music ability and perfect pitch is increased in tonal languages, so that's one question, is that a old wives' tale or myth or whatever? And then the other part of that is, does amusia interfere with speech in learning tonal languages?
Yes, I mean, that's typically the good questions, of course, and typically I do address them, but I didn't have enough time. So for the first question, it makes so much sense to check if you can find cases of amusia in populations who speak a tonal language. And when we say tonal language, it's because they use pitch as a way to convey meaning. So it's very important for them to pick that up. And it is a little bit more fine-grained than what we use in everyday speech. In English and in French, the way we manipulate prosody is much coarse, not fine-grained compared to tonal languages. So to answer the first question, the other aspect is really leading to the other question related to speech or intonation. So among speakers of a tonal language, you do find the same prevalence of amusia. So it does not protect, to acquire a tonal language does not protect you from developing that neurogenetic disorder. First, and it has been documented in many different papers. We did it first, but it has been replicated in different countries and for different languages. Of course, if you manipulate pitch so that it is really, really fine-grained, like in certain tonal languages where pitch is really subtly changed, then they do have a problem, especially to identify the tones, but not to produce it. So again, we find a dissociation between whatever it's related to awareness, learning the code, and spontaneously using the code among speakers of tonal languages. So it is a very interesting avenue. Now related to speech. Of course, we checked intonation. And as I said, in English and in French, the way we use intonation in everyday life is rather a coarse use of pitch compared to what we do in music. In music, as I mentioned in my talk, it is really related to a semitone, to 100 cents, the two adjacent keys. That's the meaningful difference. And we do perceive more than that, more refined than 100 cents. But in speech, when I'm making a claim, for example, my pitch will go down by 7 semitones. And if I'm asking a question or using a pitch accent, I'm using 12 semitones. So it's huge. And even if you have a poor system for tracking pitch differences, you will pick those ones. So that's the reason they don't really have a problem with their speech, intonation, and prosody in everyday life. But if we do manipulate it, and we have done it, of course, in the lab, by a few semitones, then they do have a deficit. They do show a deficit. So it's not specific to music. It's just music relevant.
Isabel, stay up here for a sec, because we have a couple questions, and we have some time. So have you found a correlation, can you hear me, between those with amusia and difficulty in learning mathematics?
Okay, I have to be a little bit more specific here. I am interested by those co-occurrence now, more than in the past, because it's so similar to the other learning disorders, specifically to dyslexia and to prosopagnosia, the fact that people don't recognize faces, and I'm affected. So to go back to the questions, we studied, and the form I described here is related to pitch processing. There are other forms of amusia related to rhythm. The reason I'm bringing that up is because we don't find any associated disorder to the pitch form of amusia, but we do see differences for those who have a rhythmic problem. They do have a problem with dyslexia. They do have a problem with other kind of learning disorders. I mean, they seem to have it all. So if we study, I think that by studying those cases more, we will learn more about the association between the disorders than by studying the one I described.
So Isabel, a couple of more questions. I'll just throw them at you. What's the frequency of amusia in Western populations? I guess there's a question of how to diagnose it, but so the frequency is a big question. And then there was one other that's attached to that. Let me see. Here, why don't you ask that? Why don't you answer that while I'm looking? Yeah.
I thought I mentioned it in my first slides. I'm sorry if it went too fast, but the prevalence is 1.5. But of course, it always depends on how you compute it, and this is true for any kind of disorder. So for amusia, it can go up to 4%, and it is, fortunately, we all use the same battery of evaluation or the same test, so that we can compare from one country to another or from one lab to another. But if you are strict like we were, and it was a very large base testing, online testing of more than 20,000 subjects, participants, volunteers, we could determine that only 1.5% was affected, which is large, of course, because we only selected those who were impaired by 2 standard deviation below the mean for the pitch-related test. We used 2 different tests, so we used converging evidence, and they had to perform correctly on a 3rd test related to rhythm. The reason we do require that is that there are attentional deficits, there are other kind of deficits that are not really related to music, but problems to perform this kind of testing. So we eliminate those by using a control condition, if you like. And by doing that, we found 1.5%. That's a long explanation, but it's a very good question because it's important to know how we measure prevalence.
Thank you. I think, well, we have a lot of really interesting questions. I'm just trying to, maybe Adam Alkelford could answer this, although Isabel probably could too. So maybe Isabel will start, and then Adam. Why do people like music? What purpose does it serve? And there's an evolutionary question in there as well, right? Yeah. So, floor is open. Yeah.
Well, this is the typical question, huh? And we cannot avoid it. So I'd like to know what you reply to those questions. I mean, I have heard that question for 30 years. What's the purpose of music? We don't know. And your speculation is as good as mine, except that nowadays there are more and more scientific studies on the question. For many years, I mean, it's just a philosophical question, or it depends on what you believe. And of course, they were the kind of provocation of Steven Pinker, who said, oh, music is like auditory cheesecake, pure pleasure for the ears, but it serves nothing. I mean, it's useless. So this provoked a lot of work, activity in the labs, and we did too. But what is really compelling is that music, we don't really understand the relation with the pleasure, but this is a way to preserve, the bonding and the group activities. Music is one of the best cement to form a cohesive group. I presented in my first line, To Be Born Musical, the fact that children who are moved in synchrony with an adult will be more social. I mean, he will be more cooperative with that adult than with someone who didn't synchronize at the same time. And there are lots of studies like this that are coming up now. I wouldn't say every day, but really recently. It's something that now we take very seriously in the lab and we try to answer. There is not much about the other idea that goes back to Darwin, who said that music is really like the peacock tail, just to seduce the other gender. For now, as far as I know, maybe you know better, but...
I have an answer as you're talking.
Okay. Go ahead.
How many of you have a teenager? It keeps you from killing your teenager. It's the only thing you can talk about with your teenagers sometimes is music. Anyway, sorry for that. I just couldn't help it late in the afternoon. The only thing I have in common with my 17-year-old.
Yeah, but that's bonding and social too.
Yes, exactly.
No, I was talking about something else. It's just the fact that, when you play music, it's hard to fake. And so it's telling the female, that really your genes are maybe better than someone who cannot really play music. That's the idea. I mean, it's not stupid, but it's hard to prove. I mean, some people have computed the number of offsprings of very famous musicians, but there is a confound. There is, okay, come Simon, please.
I was going to say your family, your A music.
Mm-hmm.
You have lots of kids, right? So he doesn't seem to have any problem.
Not many. I mean, Tim Falconer has none. Yeah, well, yeah, we can go back, but believe me, they don't have many offsprings. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, there's interesting work by Colwyn Trevarthen on communicative musicality, which I think goes back to the early bonding between caregiver and babies. And it seems that being in synchrony with little vocalizations that infants make very early on is a critical part of that bonding process, and seems to precede language as well. So it could be that music is a vital building block, because the first way we communicate is not through words, but through emoting through sound. And by mirroring that, we can begin to get a sense of what someone else feels, beginnings of empathy maybe. So it could be that both ontogenetically and maybe phylogenetically, music was a crucial part on the journey towards language.
Stay up here, because I want to explore that a little bit. It's an interesting idea, because when I think of social cognition, the first kind of a disruption in that seen in autism is this thing called joint attention that infants are developing, and so it's almost paradoxical that a lot of these savant abilities, or autistic and even nonverbal autistic children, might have very substantial musical abilities. And in fact, you can begin to teach people, and people with even acquired aphasias can do quite well if you begin to get them to sing, using their right hemisphere. So I wonder, if you could elaborate that connection a little bit for the neurologist in me.
I've just written a paper on, is there such a thing as musical empathy, as opposed to cognitive empathy and emotional empathy in everyday life. And I think there is, and I think autistic children I work with often have musical empathy, so we can interrelate, have humor, have teasing, have sadness, have joy, and yet they can't empathize in everyday life. So I think that specifically in the context of music, there is that bonding, but it doesn't seem to transfer very easily. I think that's probably the thing.
It's really fascinating, because they do, a lot of children will love to be hugged and show kind of, some kind of, those emotional relationships, but without the norm, the typical. It's interesting. Thank you. Okay, let's change a little bit. Let's go to Dr. Miller. In the case of Jack, what significance may lie in the yellow and purple as colors that are simultaneously intensifying as elements of visual perception?
Yeah, so a great question, and thought a lot about it. And one of the most amazing things about the patients who do this is their language and their thought is so disordered and impaired that they almost never can tell you about this. But I think our sense is that with these diseases, which are anterior temporal left or anterior inferior frontal left, that there is either release of circuitry that is posterior or actually remodeling of posterior circuitry. We're in the process of analyzing all of our experience with these patients since I've been at UCSF, which is about 18 years. And I do think there are certain colors that are thematically used more, and I think purple and yellow are two such colors. But I think we need statistics on this, yeah.
Stay up here.
Yeah.
I've tried to organize to some success. In your talk, you have mentioned people with semantic, I think it's dementia, making a mistake about colors of animals. Does this imply that language determines, that the thesis that language determines our information processing in categories?
Yeah, I think yes. I mean, I think we see really two sort of degenerative models for this. One is when the left side of the brain degenerates, we lose lots of knowledge about things, animals, I think vegetables, food. When the right side degenerates, we lose knowledge about people and faces and the emotions. So very, very different sort of presentations. And, I think the anterior temporal lobe is a node, I think, for verbal and semantic knowledge, the sort of knowledge that we start layering on as children. And, I think this is the nidus of the degeneration and semantic variant, and you do lose these language-based concepts, absolutely. Yeah.
So from that perspective, then, if you lose the word frog, you've lost the concept of a frog in that way? Is that, with that?
I mean, in Alzheimer's, almost never. So in Alzheimer's, often the anatomic lesion for losing the ability to say the word frog is posterior temporal parietal. These patients are very different. So Alzheimer patient, frog, oh yeah, frog. So it's on the tip of the tongue. And it's very late in the process that they lose the concept for a frog. But when the degeneration is left anterior temporal lobe, the loss of the concept of frog, what a frog is. These are people, if you give them an IQ test, the thing that they do worst on is general knowledge. So they are losing, knowledge about what Shakespeare wrote, what a table is made of, all of these facts that are accumulated very early.
Thank you. So here's a question for Simon Fisher. Are there people born with speech disability, but who have normal, let's say, other verbal abilities? I'm assuming reading comprehension abilities, for example.
Yes. There's a lot of different types of speech and language disorders. Many of them have high heritability. There are some speech problems that are very predominantly just about they're kind of dysarthric. So you can have a developmental dysarthria that means that actually you have problems physically making the right kind of sounds. In some cases, you can have a combination of speech apraxia and dysarthria, although it's hard to pull those apart. You can have children who are there are many kids that we study who have language impairments, expressive, receptive kind of language impairments, but their speech sequencing abilities are normal. So there's a range of different profiles of different kids, and often it's quite messy. In the early days of studying, of looking for genes involved in language disorders, there were some people who were really focusing on trying to find a gene for grammar, for example, or finding specific lesions that might just take out one aspect of language function, and I think most of that has proved not to be true. So it's a kind of grey area between some kids have relatively profiles where certain aspects are more impaired than others. Many kids have these kind of messy profiles, but speech problems can definitely be dissociated from linguistic problems as well. I don't know if that's fully answered the question. I've gone in a few different directions. But
yeah, thanks. But stay up. Because you said you're not going to say anything political, thank you for this question of whoever sent this. What would your diagnosis of the current POTUS be? Temporary POTUS, somebody said. Some have said malignant narcissism. Well, anyway, we'll move on from there.
Actually, I have to say we have a student in my lab who's a clinical geneticist. So she's trained as a clinical geneticist, and she studies all these different kids with different syndromes, like the Williams syndrome. There's lots and lots of these different syndromes out there now, and it's almost like for every gene there might be a little mini syndrome associated with it when you get a mutation. And she was going through some examples of different types of speech disorders that we were studying at the time, and then she came up with a kind of test case. This was just before the American elections, and she basically described this whole phenotype, including the kind of mouth phenotype, things like that, for the current POTUS, and the behavioral phenotype, and said, and can anyone say anything about the diagnosis of this person? So, yes.
He doesn't have Williams syndrome.
No, definitely not Williams syndrome, and not speech apraxia.
Thanks, Simon. So there was a question for Geschwind or anyone, and so anyone will answer. We have little difficulty discussing human variation at the individual level, but at the group level, things get dicey. Do we need to find a better approach to discussing group level differences? It's a really great question because they often get confused and confounded. And of course, there's an enormous amount of human individual variability, and that's the point, is that you can't apply means, averages, groups to individuals, and that's where things kind of get off. I'll just leave it there. I mean, that's, I think it's a very good point, and I think it gets confounded, those two things. When somebody is speaking about individual differences, they're not speaking about the average, they're speaking about individuals, and when you apply an average to an individual, you're losing a lot, usually wrong. So, let's see, there are a couple more, let's see, I think we have time. There are a couple more interesting questions for Dr. McGaw. Get ready. Can an HSAM remember where he, she left his or her keys?
No, as a matter of fact, that's one of their complaints. They lose their keys and can't find them. I tested a lot of them on their personal details. And Jill Price has never learned the air license plate number on her car. And she walks past it every day when she goes to the garage. So these kinds of incidental things are not picked up at all because that's not what they focus on. They focus on either their lives and the events in their lives that they want to remember or don't, or even on imaginary lives. Some of them make up stories which they maintain. If I could just say briefly, one of our subjects invented a college basketball team in his head when he was 13 years old, and he has kept that as a college basketball team that in his imagination plays other real college basketball teams, and he does this on a regular basis, and he's done this since he's 13 years old. He's now 60 years old, and from time to time I get a news release that say how well they did in the NC2A tournament and so on, and he spends an enormous amount of time doing this, and you might say, why does he do it? And one answer is because he can. That is, he has the ability, and we have tested him on his ability to remember all of the details. They live different kinds of lives from people who don't have the ability, and if they have had pleasant experiences in their life and they dwell on that, then they have one kind of a life. If they have had unpleasant experiences that they believe they should remember, that's another one. And if they have hobbies that require a lot of this kind of memory, then they do very well with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I think we're kind of, most of the other questions are kind of very similar. So Isabel had suggested maybe some of the speakers want to ask each other questions, or there are other questions that people just want to ask. I don't know if that's too far out of the realm of what we do. I know we're going to have a whole day of that tomorrow, but I'll repeat that. Yeah. So Dr. Miller wanted to ask Karen Berman about empathy and Williams syndrome.
So the question is about empathy, and are they more empathic than other children? Did I get that right? Okay. So empathy is a broad concept. It's kind of one of these things that we kind of know it when we see it, but it can also be studied in the laboratory experimentally in the behavioral lab. For example, one of the very good papers was about an investigator who would sit with a child with Williams syndrome or other children and bang his or her knee. And how many, what level of concern does the child have for that? And it's quite significant in comparison to typically developing children or children with various developmental disorders like Downs or others. So it's there, and it can be measured experimentally. And we sort of do know it when we see it. If I show up to one of my children with my cane, I get way more questions about it than I would from anyone else, and expressions of concern.
Thank you. This question and answer session reminds me of the time when I was crossing a border somewhere, and my youngest was about 5 years old, and he saw all the guards querying us for minutes, each of the adults, and he came up and he said, "Are you going to ask me a hard math question?" Always get worried about that. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for the for the questions. Are there any more remaining questions? I think we have 3 minutes, and it's really time for closing remarks. So I'm going to introduce Margaret Schoeninger, who's the CARTA co-director, to give us some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I just wanted to thank the audience, those people who stayed throughout the whole afternoon. Thank you very much. I did want to particularly thank the symposium chairs. This was an amazing collection of speakers and really fascinating talks. You have already thanked the speakers, but I want to thank them again for coming here and giving us really fascinating things to think about. I would also like to thank our supporters, our individual supporters who made this possible, including the Mathers Foundation. But there are others individual supporters, some of whom really don't want us to give their names, so I won't. But we do want them to know we very much appreciate it. And then also the questions that you all have asked, we very much, it's been a lot of fun to think about those things. I want to highlight, though, I want to point you in the direction of this isn't the end. We have many very interesting symposia coming up. One is in September of this next fall, and that will be cellular and molecular explorations of anthropogeny, the origin of humans. In the winter of 2018, I'm particularly interested in this one, is the role of hunting in the origin of humans. This will not be just the man, the hunter, redo, but we will be thinking about the role of hunting and obtaining of a very high quality protein is the way I would look at it. In the spring of 2018, we're looking at imagination in human origins. I had a conversation with someone during the break, and I said, how do you know what my dog imagines and what my dog doesn't imagine? So that's the kind of thing someone is going to tell us about. I think my dog has a great imagination, actually, when she's asleep. In the fall of 2018, we're going to look at the impact of tools and technology on the evolution of the human mind. And we can think about all kinds of different technologies. We talk about tools, and many of them are stone because they actually, in the very early period, those are the ones that are preserved. But we don't know exactly what other tools were there in the very beginning, and we can begin to see things that are ephemeral later and that will not be preserved in a long-term fossil record. So please keep notice of what we're doing, and yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Rusty. I want to talk about the future Kavli Institute symposia. Thank you. And December of 2017, we are going to have imaging the brain from molecules to circuits and beyond. So we'll take it from all levels in the brain, and I hope you realize that the drawing that you saw in the very beginning with the yellows and the purples is the human brain, but with gorgeous colors in it, very similar to the parrot, actually. When I saw the parrot, I thought of this picture. Thank you, Jesse, for that picture. All right. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the future.